interesting. I'll put a plug in for them. I don't know if you can get on it or not, but they've got one coming up about the Women Explorers Club, and there are four featured women that they're going to have on it are Sylvia Earle and Catherine Sullivan. And then I don't know the other two, but it sounds like it would really be a good program.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Jerry, we just did a all day Saturday 7-hour conference for ACS. Had speakers from all over the world all day on a Saturday, Zooming, with people from 40 countries. I'm stealing Leanne's introduction. Leanne, why don't we go ahead and get you to fire up, and we'll get our speaker going.
I was hoping to find, I lost Deneb's information, and so I was hoping I could find it. And I have to warn you, I have a puppy. He's 4 months old and is running around. He just knocked over a box. It scared him. So let me, I apologize. Let's see. All right, so welcome everyone. I want to thank you for joining us. We are going to start off our meeting with doing a review of 2020, which in some ways can be scary, but it's not too bad. I want to introduce our board. Jane Vanderhagen has been the president for the last couple of years, and she and I will be co-president. I'm Leanne Gibbons, and we'll be co-president for the upcoming year. And then we have Rick Matthews, who is our treasurer, George Little, who is our secretary, Sarah Dabadine is our programs director, Carrie Strand does our community outreach and whale watching, and then Jennifer Halbretter and Jesse Richter are both part of our social media and promotions team. And so I want to say a big thank you to all of our board members. Our treasurer's report this year, we've got a balance of $2,715 and some change. We have very few expenses, and that's in part because this year, well, because we've had a lot of good programs offer their services to us, like the Scripps Institute, where we usually meet in person. But our expenses this year have pretty much been for Zoom. And when we do have face-to-face meetings, we also take out our guest speakers to dinners before the lectures. We currently have 41 official members. Our past activities in 2020 were very limited, obviously because of COVID. We had community outreach programs or events scheduled, but they were canceled. And so because those events were canceled and we were able to bring in Zoom, we were able to increase the number of speakers that we've had. And in the future, we plan to, once things open up, we hope to have more face-to-face events. And we're working with some of our whale watching outfits to bring more group activities. Currently, we have 2 companies that are working with us to provide discounts, and that's San Diego Whale Watch and Legacy Whale Watch. And we will post, or we will be sending emails to our members letting them know about the benefits, and then also update our website, and that's acssandiego.org, where you can check the website to find out about things that are coming up, or discounts and whale watching events that are coming up. In March, we have Ricky Robledo to talk about Mexico's marine wildlife conservation efforts. On April 14th, we've got Barbara Taylor and Lorenzo, who will give us a vaquita update. And then in anticipation of things opening up in the community, Balboa Park is planning to host Earth Day on September 19th. And we will be posting more information about that event because we'll be looking for volunteers. we usually, try to talk about beach cleanups or things going on in the community, and there haven't been any virtual or person-to-person beach cleanups. But I love San Diego, or excuse me, I love A Clean San Diego is still hosting community cleanups. And obviously we know that they're not beach cleanups, but the garbage that they're cleaning up is reducing the waste in the watershed that does end up in the oceans or near the beaches. And so we've posted the February dates for those cleanups on our website. And we hope, to see you out there. The whale watching season, or the gray whale season, is well underway, and we've had some incredible sightings and interactions. And so we encourage you to check out our website for a list of San Diego whale watching companies that are getting out there and taking people out on the water. We just had our the ACS National Conference, which was held January 30th. And this year was just kind of an amazing phenomenon because of COVID. We did not have the conference in person, but we were able to do it on Zoom, and we were able to do it for free. So we had approximately 1,750 people who signed up for the conference, and they were from approximately 45 different countries. So that's just phenomenal in and of itself. And if you were not able to participate on January 30th to see the lectures, they were recorded and they're being edited, and possibly by the end of the month, we should have them posted online, and you can watch them, at your own pace. And again, we'll be updating our website, and that again is acssandiego.org, so that you can watch those as they, or once they're posted. If you are interested in becoming a member or would like to present for our members, or if you have any suggestions for us, again, please visit our website, and that's acssandiego.org. Tonight's speaker, and I apologize, I have misplaced some stuff, so I need to look one place, and otherwise, I again apologize, Deneb, if you don't mind.
I can introduce myself. That's fine.
I'm so sorry. Thank you very much. And then we have Deneb Karentz about Antarctica, the science and policy on a frozen continent.
Let me just take a little personal privilege here. Thanks, Leanne. Good job on your first shot. And I just want to say Zoom etiquette. Everybody, please stay muted until the end. You can put questions in the chat room. We will be able to ask Deneb those questions, or depending on how it goes, we could unmute folks. But thank you very much, and let's go. Let's have fun.
So I'm going to just go ahead and start by sharing my screen and getting the presentation started, and then I'll tell you who I am. Okay, are we all set in terms of being able to see?
Perfect. It looks great.
Okay.
Title slide.
Okay. Great. So my name is Deneb Karentz, and I'm a professor at the University of San Francisco. I have a joint appointment in the Department of Biology and also in the Department of Environmental Science. And I have been working in the Antarctic since 1985. And I'm a marine biologist, and I focus on phytoplankton. So I work with tiny things in the ocean. But fortunately, when you go to the Antarctic, you get to see the really big things as well. And I have also been involved not only in research in the Antarctic, but I have been involved more recently in about the last 8 years or so in policy. And so I serve as the US delegate to an organization called the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. And I'll talk about that today. And then I also am a science advisor to the State Department for the Antarctic Treaty. And I'll talk a little bit about that today as well. And I've also served as a program officer at NSF in the Office of Polar Programs in the Antarctic Sciences section. And I'm going to talk a little bit about NSF today as well. So please save questions. I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the talk. And I'm assuming, I know that Jerry's been to the Antarctic. I'm assuming there might be others of you that have visited Antarctica. And so at the end of the talk, I'd really be happy to have you add anything that you want to what I've said during this presentation. So I'm first going to show you this really beautiful satellite image of the Earth from space. And you can see the Antarctic continent and the sea ice surrounding Antarctica. And that sea ice is on top of the Southern Ocean. And I also wanted to put a little bit of perspective in terms of the South Pole and the North Pole, because there are a number of differences between them. Physically, in the Arctic, we have an ocean basin. So we have the Arctic Ocean surrounded by continents. And in the Antarctic, we have a continent surrounded by an ocean, the Southern Ocean. In the Arctic, we also have permanent residents. And in the Antarctic, we have transient residents. There are really no fixed communities in Antarctica. And then the other thing that most people tend to get mixed up about is that if you want to see polar bears, you go to the Arctic. And if you want to see penguins, you go to the Antarctic. And these two animals do not come in contact with each other in the natural world. Some just basic facts about Antarctica. It's the 5th largest of the 6 continents, covers over 5 million square miles, and only a very small percentage of that area is currently ice-free. So most of the continent is covered with ice. And the average thickness of the ice cap is estimated to be about 1.7 miles. And in some places, it's as thick as 3 miles. And I think it's hard to imagine how much ice that is, but there is so much ice on top of the Antarctic that it literally depresses the continent so that it's below sea level. So we're talking about a really massive amount of frozen water. And in these figures here, I know my cursor shows up. Can you still hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I just got a message that said my sound wasn't detectable. I'm sorry, I can't get my cursor on top of the presentation, but in that middle slide, you can see the size of the Antarctic relative to the area of the United States. And then the map on the right, you can see the position of the continent and then the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans coming in and meeting where the Southern Ocean is. It's really not possible to talk about the Antarctic without using superlatives. And so we have the coldest, the windiest, the highest, the driest continent. So it truly is an extreme environment. And this makes it very challenging in terms of the organisms surviving in the Antarctic. It gives us a lot of insights into evolutionary aspects of biology. And it's also a very challenging place to work. And I know Jerry can add a lot to that statement. So it's a really incredible place. And as I said, I think there's probably others of you in the audience who might have visited the Antarctic. And it's really a remarkable and a very special place. I actually want to start off talking a little bit about human history in Antarctica. And so we have this heroic age of Antarctic exploration. So in terms of humans interacting with this region of the world, it's a very short history, it's very recent history. And so the continent was probably not sighted by modern humans anyway, until the early part of the 1800s. And then of course we have Amundsen, the Norwegian, who was the first person who actually reached the South Pole. We have Scott from the UK who got to the South Pole but didn't make it home. And then a lot of people are very familiar with Shackleton and the heroic expedition that involved the Endurance. And that early period between 1820 and 1917, there were a number of expeditions, 17 expeditions that were sponsored by 10 different countries of people going to the Antarctic. A lot of it was done as, we're going to go and say that we've been there, but a lot of those expeditions also took scientists. So we do have some really early data that were collected by scientists who were on these expeditions that took place in the 18 and 1900s. Things kind of slowed down in 1917 because of the world wars, but interest in the Antarctic was sort of rejuvenated in the 1957-1958 International Geophysical Year. And so this was a period of time where countries came together and collaborated on some really big endeavors in research. The focus for the IGY was on earth sciences. And there were 12 countries that collaborated in conducting research in the Antarctic. And the data collected during the IGY was very important. It pretty much triggered a lot of things that we still do today. And the countries that did the research in Antarctica decided that they wanted to continue those kinds of collaborations from the IGY into the future. And so they created the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, SCAR, and they also put into effect the Antarctic Treaty. So I'd like to talk a little bit about each of these because today SCAR and the Antarctic Treaty are a very big part of what happens in terms of human activities in the Antarctic and also in terms of international collaborations. So SCAR is an international interdisciplinary organization. As I said before, I'm the US delegate to SCAR, and SCAR is part of the ISC, the International Science Council. And the International Science Council is a large umbrella organization. So if you went to their website, you would see lots and lots of scientific organizations and social science organizations that fall under the ISC. SCAR, as I said, was established because of the IGY. So it was set up in 1958 as a way for the countries who are collaborating in the Antarctic to continue those international cooperations. Today, SCAR has 32 member countries. So these are countries that have active Antarctic research programs. There are 9 of the ISC unions that are members of SCAR. And then there are 12 associate member countries. And so these are countries that are developing Antarctic programs. SCAR meets meets every 2 years. And along with the business meetings with the delegates, there's also an open science conference. And so the SCAR meetings are a really incredible way for scientists from all around the world to come together and to meet and talk about science in the Antarctic. As an organization, SCAR has 2 missions, or there's 2 parts to its mission. The first one is science leadership. So SCAR plays a really big role in fostering international collaborations for research in the Antarctic. SCAR will identify specific areas of research that are at the cutting edge of what we need to know about the Antarctic environment. And then SCAR provides a framework within which scientists from different countries can meet and collaborate. One of the ways in which this is done is through SCAR's scientific research programs. And so currently we have 3 SRPs, and these were just adopted in 2020. So these are brand new. And these scientific research programs, they usually have a lifespan of about 6 or 7 years. And then they either morph into something else or they get changed completely into something new. So these are the current ones: integrated science to inform Antarctic and Southern Ocean conservation, instabilities and thresholds in Antarctica, and near-term variability and prediction of the Antarctic climate system. So Anticon is looking at scientific research that's going to be used to inform policy. So a lot of that is going to be fed into the Antarctic Treaty system. Instant is looking at the way that Antarctica in the past, present, and future will be affecting sea level rise. And then Anticlimb Now is looking at prediction of conditions in the Antarctica in the short term, in time scales of years to decades. SCAR has a lot of other parts to its structure that deal with specific aspects of the Antarctic system. So if you were to go to the SCAR website, you could see a whole range of different kinds of committees and action groups that are involved in Antarctic science. So we have this first part of the mission, which is science leadership. The second part of the mission is to provide scientific advice. And as I said, a lot of this advice feeds into the treaty system. There are times when the Antarctic Treaty system will actually come to SCAR and request specific information. And then there are times when SCAR has information that they feel the Antarctic Treaty should be aware of, and they'll provide that to the treaty parties. And then occasionally there are other groups that will come to SCAR and ask for various kinds of advice. So within SCAR, we have a lot of these groups that have expertise in specific areas of research or specific topics in science. And these are all international committees and action groups. And so they can provide reports or they can make presentations and make that information available. And for the Antarctic Treaty System, this information is used to set policy and to determine how to manage the environment in the Antarctic. So the Antarctic Treaty, it pretty much goes hand in hand in terms of timing with the origin of SCAR. The treaty was signed in 1959, again, by the countries that were involved with Antarctic research during the IGY. And currently there are 29 full member countries that are part of the treaty and 24 non-consultative parties. The treaty meets once a year. And so they get together and make decisions on an annual basis. The Antarctic Treaty is a very interesting treaty. You can look it up online. It's actually quite short and it's very readable. And it's the first of the post-World War II arms limitation agreements. And the treaty very clearly states that Antarctica is a demilitarized zone. And so it's there for peaceful purposes only. And the treaty also very clearly states, there's no ambiguity in this, that the treaty is to promote international and scientific cooperation in Antarctica. In addition to the treaty itself, there's 2 conventions and a protocol that are part of the treaty system. So there's the Convention on Conservation of Antarctic Seals, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and then the Protocol on Environmental Protection. And the Protocol on Environmental Protection has a committee that was formed, the Committee on Environmental Protection, or the CEP. And that committee is the one that reviews a lot of what goes on in the Antarctic relative to the environmental aspects, and then they make recommendations to the actual treaty itself. And I attend the Committee on Environmental Protection meetings as a science advisor to the State Department. So the Protocol on Environmental Protection also has some very clearly stated things about it, which, for example, the first bullet point, it designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And the Committee on Environmental Protection, at their meetings, which last a week, discuss a lot of things that are for regulating human activities in the Antarctic. One of the things that the protocol does is it prevents economic endeavors in the Antarctic. So it limits things like mining for mineral resources. And the committee also addresses a lot of other issues. So for example, if a country wanted to build a new research station, or if they have a research station that they want to renovate, that usually goes through this Committee on Environmental Protection. And there are environmental assessment reports that are made. Progress is usually reported every year. They also look into things like biological conservation, looking at invasive species. Tourism is a big part of the Antarctic Treaty and also the Protocol on Environmental Protection. Just to give you a sense of how big tourism is in the Antarctic, in the 2019 season, so before COVID, 56,000 tourists visited Antarctica. And 10 years before that, it was maybe 9,000 tourists. So tourism takes up a lot of the discussion in terms of how to manage the Antarctic environment. So internationally, you have the Antarctic Treaty System for environmental management and conservation of the Antarctic. And there's also an organization called the Council of Managers for National Programs. So each country that has an Antarctic program has someone who's in charge of it. And so those managers are the ones that are the members of this council. And so these are this is the group that, they make the rules. So for example, when I go to the Antarctic, I go to the different stations, there are lots of rules and regulations on what I can and cannot do. And most of those are set, in my case, by NSF, and the person in charge of the US Antarctic program at NSF is a member, in fact, at the moment, is the president of the Council of Managers for National Programs. At the US level, we have the National Science Foundation, which is the federal agency that oversees the US Antarctic program, which was established in 1959 along with SCAR and the Antarctic Treaty. We also have the Marine Mammal Act, which I'm sure you're all aware of, that governs US citizens' behavior no matter where they are. So it applies to us in the Antarctic as well. And then the Antarctic Conservation Act. So for example, if I'm going to the Antarctic and I want to collect certain things, I actually need to apply and get a permit, which comes through the ACA. So the National Science Foundation, as I said, oversees the US Antarctic program. And that's done through the Office of Polar Programs. And the Office of Polar Programs has a group of people that work in the Antarctic infrastructure and logistics section. And then there's also an Antarctic sciences section. So infrastructure and logistics, this is the group that's responsible for getting us to the Antarctic and taking care of us while we're there. And as scientists, we really have it's a pretty nice situation. You get to the Antarctic and pretty much everything is taken care of. You just have to do your research. So we're talking, cooks and janitors and mechanics and plumbers, electricians, people that take care of computers. Everything there is supported. And so the logistics is a really crucial aspect of us being able to do our research. And then the Antarctic Sciences section, these are the science programs. There are 6 science programs within the Antarctic Sciences section at NSF. And you can see they cover pretty much the entire range of science. And so we have other federal agencies that also conduct research in the Antarctic or fund research in the Antarctic, NASA, USGS, NOAA, just as some examples. They provide funding for research in the Antarctic, but they still have to funnel through the US Antarctic program through NSF in order for the logistics aspect of it. For the US Antarctic program, in Antarctica, there are 3 permanent US bases, McMurdo Station, Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, and Palmer Station. And in addition, there are a number of field camps. So people might go to McMurdo and then head out to a field camp for a couple weeks or a couple of months. So we have, in addition to these 3 stations, there's also the 2 icebreakers. So there's people that will go out on research cruises. And then there's assorted other places where people will go in order to get research done. So people always ask me, how do you get there? And it's always an adventure getting to the Antarctic. So depending upon whether you're going to Palmer Station or to McMurdo and South Pole, there's a commercial flight. So you fly either to the southern end of Chile if you're going to Palmer Station, or you fly to New Zealand if you're going to McMurdo or to South Pole. To get from Chile to Palmer Station, which is on the peninsula, we usually go by ship. And so the two research vessels, the two icebreakers, are also used as passenger vessels to get us back and forth to the station. And then if you fly to Christchurch on a commercial flight, you'll be flying to McMurdo on a military flight. Although I did once go to McMurdo by ship, so you can go to McMurdo from New Zealand on one of the icebreakers. But typically the majority of people are going by plane. And so here's just two examples. There's a C-130 on the left side and a C-17 on the right. I've also flown down in C-141s. And then in the middle, I put a picture of what the inside of the plane of a C-130 looks like, because it's not your typical United or American Airlines flight. The trip from Punta Arenas to Palmer on the ship will take about 4 to 5 days, depending on how much ice is in the way. And the flight to McMurdo, depending upon what kind of aircraft, might be 4 to 8 hours. So, so it's an interesting trip. Always a challenge to figure out how long it's going to take you and if it's going to get canceled or not. But it's very reliable transportation, and we eventually get to where we want to be. I'm a marine biologist, so most of the work I do is actually on the ice. So here's a picture of the ice edge. Actually, this is the ship channel. And this is the sea ice, and then far off in the distance, you can see the ice edge. And this isn't really a science talk, so I'm not going to talk about the research that I've done, but I thought I would at least tell you a little bit about the kind of work that I do. So my initial trip to the Antarctic, I actually volunteered to go on somebody else's field project, thinking it was my once in a lifetime chance to go to the Antarctic. But in fact, I ended up getting the chance to go back many times after that. And my initial research in the Antarctic was related to ozone depletion. So we have this really incredible phenomenon of the Antarctic ozone depletion cycle, which is referred to as the Antarctic ozone hole. And when this happens, which is during the Antarctic spring, the depletion of ozone means that you're getting a lot more ultraviolet light coming down to the Earth's surface. And so I was very interested in how this increase in ultraviolet light affected phytoplankton. And so here's an Antarctic phytoplankton cell. And my interests were in looking at DNA damage. When ultraviolet light is absorbed by DNA molecules, the DNA molecules are structurally damaged, and that damage can cause a lot of problems if it's not properly repaired. So I did a lot of work looking at that aspect of the physiology of diatoms, these phytoplankton. And then I was also interested in what kinds of mechanisms these unicellular organisms had to protect themselves from ultraviolet light. And so I also did a lot of research looking at compounds like this one, these mycosporine-like amino acids, to see what their prevalence was in the Antarctic and also how much protection they provided. And it turns out that many marine organisms, at least in the algae and the invertebrates, contain these compounds. And so they act as natural sunscreens. So that's what a lot of my research has been in that area. But I've also spent a lot of time in the Antarctic working with the NSF Advanced Training Program. And so I'm co-director for this training program in Antarctica for early career scientists. And this program was initiated by Donald Manahan at University of Southern California. It started in 1994, and it was designed for graduate students and postdocs who were interested in working in the Antarctic, but who had never had the opportunity to go there. And if you've never been to the Antarctic and you've never experienced working under those challenging conditions, it's a little bit daunting to try to write a proposal and convince people that you can go there and do the work. And so we take groups of students down there and they work in the field. We have lectures, we have discussions, they learn about what the current questions are in Antarctic science. And it gives them a chance to get a feel of what's involved in terms of the logistics and the science of working in the Antarctic. The program is international. And since 1994, we've had this, it's run 11 times. And we've had 270 participants representing 142 different universities and institutes. These are coming from 24 different countries, 33 nationalities. And it's been a very successful program. Many of the people who have participated have gone on and continued in Antarctic or polar research. And for me, it's actually been an incredibly rewarding program to be involved with. It's been really exciting to meet the people that have been involved, and then to see them go on and develop their careers, and having this program give them a little bit of a push or an advantage and get them really excited about working in this extreme environment. So if you have been to the Antarctic, or if you haven't been to the Antarctic, this is pretty much what you will see. On a big scale, it's just very white. And you don't see a lot of biology. The organisms, for the most part, are marine, so they're underneath the ice that you see here. There are some terrestrial, aquatic, and terrestrial land communities. The organisms, though, are quite small. They're almost microscopic. But in the ocean, there's actually a lot. You can't see it. It's like, just like here, if you look out at the beach, you're not going to see all kinds of life jumping out. So I put together some slides just to kind of give you a sense of what it's like to travel around in the Antarctic and to work under Antarctic conditions. So for me, again, as a marine biologist, I really want to get to the water. And so I do a lot of work traveling on the ice. And the US Antarctic program provides us with a lot of different ways in which we can do this. So here's a collage that just kind of shows an array of ways in which we get around. So you can put on cross-country skis and ski to your sample sites. We've done that a lot. There's snowmobiles and other kind of track vehicles that we can actually drive across the ice to get to sample areas. We work off the ships. And then we also work with zodiacs. And with the zodiacs, you can do a lot of local sampling. You can't go very long range, but certainly you can get around. Even when there's ice in the water, the zodiacs work pretty well. We also can get transported around with helicopters. And this is how we get out to the ice edge. So the map that you see in the upper right shows the continent, and you can see the sea ice around the continent. And that ice edge, where the sea ice meets open water, is one of the most exciting places to be, because the amount of biology there is just amazing. There's just a lot of stuff that's going on at the ice edge. So the picture in the lower right, that's actually me. And I was probably ready to just jump out of my skin when that orca came up, because it took a breath before the person who took the picture snapped that shot. And at that day, we were probably 90 miles out from McMurdo Station. So the sea ice was pretty far out. And so this gives us a chance to get out to this really incredibly productive area. We can collect samples, we can put instruments in, we've even run experiments out there. So again, just a really amazing place to work. And then, as I said, a lot of what I do is just trying to get to the water from the ice, and we don't always go to the ice edge. And so we can actually just get out on the sea ice and we can drill holes. And then we can put instruments in, we can put plankton nets, we can put water sampling bottles, we can put people in, we have divers that can go in through those holes. And so we have a lot of opportunity to collect samples. And I have to say that the US Antarctic program it's just an incredible support system. And there's just so much that you can do if you're willing to brave the cold. If you collect samples, there's some remarkable things in the water. So here's a picture of some of the things that I've picked up in a plankton net. So up across the top are phytoplankton. And then across the bottom are some zooplankton species. And it's really interesting because when I look at these pictures, some of these things I find in San Francisco Bay. So some of the genera and even some of the species are the same as what you find in temperate areas. But these organisms are living at -2 degrees, which is about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. So the fact that you have so much biodiversity in this very, very cold system is really a biological wonder and a really interesting aspect of evolution. If you go higher up the food chain, you still have a lot of diversity. This is a picture taken by a friend of mine, Sid Bosch, of what's on the bottom. And if you look through this picture, there's on the left, there's those red sea urchins. That big blob, yellow blob in the middle is a tunicate, and there's some tube worms. And in the foreground, there's some scallops. There's a brittle star. The other yellow blob on the right is a sponge. So again, we have a lot of different organisms that are living in this very diverse, this very cold environment. And then of course, everybody asks about penguins. So Jerry, you can add to this. There are a lot of penguins in the Antarctic, although I have to say my very first trip, I never saw a penguin. It was very disappointing, but we were there. It was too cold and too early in the season. In addition to the penguins, there are other seabirds. So that's a giant petrel up in the left-hand corner and a skua in the lower right corner. And so again, as a plankton person, it's always exciting for me to be able to go out in the field and see these animals. And the penguins in particular really surprised me because they're apparently not afraid of anything out of the water. So they have no reservation just coming up and pecking on our equipment. So it's a really interesting interaction to have with them. And then of course we have the mammals. So there's seals and the whales. So the pictures here of the seals, there's the Weddell seal, the leopard seal, and elephant seal on the left side. And then a humpback whale and the orcas on the right. But again, if you go to the Antarctic and you just look out, what you see is ice and water. And so it really at times looks like a very sterile place. And I get a lot of people that will question me and they'll say, well, why do you have to go to Antarctica? What's so important? Why do we need to know what's happening there? So I'd like to just sort of finish up my talk telling you why Antarctica is important and pointing out what kinds of things we are learning in the Antarctic that are important to us being so far away from this part of the Earth. So we have the Southern Ocean, which surrounds the continent, and then we have the Pacific, the Indian, and the Atlantic Ocean all coming in. And the ocean current, the Antarctic circumpolar current that runs around the Antarctic is the world's largest ocean current. So it's moving massive amounts of water around the Southern Hemisphere. The other thing about the Antarctic is that this is one of the places in the world where you get the formation of very dense water at the surface that sinks down to depth and drives thermohaline ocean circulation. So you may have heard of the ocean conveyor belt. In this figure in the lower right, those 3 white circles that are shown represent areas in the North Atlantic and in the Antarctic where you get the formation of this very dense water. As the sea ice forms, it's only the water molecules that are freezing out, which means that salts get left behind. And so the water becomes very dense, and that dense water is very heavy, and so it sinks down. And as it sinks, it starts to move north. And so this diagram here, you can see that you have water from the Antarctic moving up into the Northern Hemisphere, and you have water from the Arctic that's moving down into the Southern Hemisphere. And this massive movement of water at very great depth is one way in which you get heat distributed around the planet. And there are places where this very dense, deep water comes up to the surface, and you get these upwelling events, and that brings nutrients and oxygen and literally fertilizes surface waters for the growth of phytoplankton. So understanding what's happening with the circumpolar current and how Antarctica contributes to the ocean conveyor belt is an important part of understanding what's happening in the oceans globally. The Antarctic also serves as an archive for Earth's past climates. So Antarctic ice cores, you can see on the map on the left that there are a number of places where very long ice cores have been drilled. Probably one of the most well-known of these is the Vostok ice core. And so the figure here on the right represents the data collected from that core. It goes back 400,000 years. The Epica Dome Sea core goes back 800,000 years. And so these ice cores can give us a look at what has happened in Earth's climate history. And that helps us understand what's going to be happening to Earth in the future. Along with that, the current conditions in the Antarctic are also providing us with insights about what's happening to climate on a global scale. So tracking changes in precipitation, temperature trends in the Antarctic, and the process of ozone depletion have all provided a lot of information that allows scientists to understand what's happened in the past and to try to predict what's going to happen in the future. Perhaps on a more practical level, Antarctica contains 90% of the ice on the planet. And that ice represents 70% of the fresh water on Earth. And the estimation is that if that ice all melted, it would raise the sea level by 190 feet. So I'm sitting here in my house in San Francisco, and I'm about 4 blocks from the Pacific Ocean. So at 190 feet, I'm pretty sure I'm underwater. To give you a perspective in terms of San Diego, I found this picture online. So this is the San Diego Convention Center at 25 feet of sea level rise. And so communities in coastal areas are obviously going to be very much affected by this. And again, I'm assuming that I'm talking to an audience that totally appreciates this problem. So I'm not going to go into a big sermon here, but this is one of the reasons why understanding what's happening in Antarctica is an important thing to do. And then finally, just in terms of understanding biology, studies that have been made on Antarctic organisms have given us a lot of information about physiology, ecology, and evolution of life on the planet. On the left, there's a picture of a fossil that was collected in the Antarctic. The Antarctic continent was not always at the South Pole. At one point, it was closer to the equator. And so the fossil record is providing a lot of information. The yellow organism that you see there in the middle towards the left is a sponge. There are a lot of organisms in the Antarctic that are being analyzed for various compounds that can be extracted. And some of these appear to have medicinal properties. And so in relation to human health, studying these organisms in Antarctica is perhaps a benefit for us. And then the little fish there on the bottom is an ice fish that has proteins in its blood that will prevent freezing. And so we have these antifreeze proteins, which keep this fish, keep the interior fluid, and it doesn't turn into an ice cube. And studying these kinds of physiological traits have provided a lot of information in terms of both ecology and evolution. And then just studying the Antarctic ecosystem has provided us with information that helps to understand ocean ecosystems at other latitudes as well. So it's a very remote place. Most people don't think about Antarctica. If they do, this is what they think of. It's just this big white patch of ice and snow. Doesn't seem very important. But I hope that what I've talked about today has given you some new information and some new insights into the Antarctic, how science and policy are determined for this area of the world, and why science in Antarctica is so important. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Deneb. And I'm going to ask a few questions that have been put into the chat room. if you don't mind. And
problem.
I invite other people, if they would like to ask a question, to enter it into the chat room. So is the ice still melting, and does global warming have anything to do with it? How much wildlife is there in Antarctica?
So the melting of ice in the Antarctic, from what I understand, is much more complicated than what's happening in the Arctic. In the Arctic, ice is definitely melting. In the Antarctic, there seems to be a difference between East and West Antarctica. And there are places in the Antarctic where ice is increasing. So there is a lot of research being done to try to determine exactly what's going on with ice melting in the Antarctic. So on the one side of the Antarctic, ice is melting very quickly. And I've even been able to see that. I go to Palmer Station. And when I first started going in the 1980s, the glacier came right down to the station and covered a lot of the harbor. And over the years, I've seen the glacier completely retreating. In fact, islands have popped up from underneath it where the glacier has gone back. And in terms of how much wildlife in the Antarctic, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Yeah, I don't know how to answer.
I guess it's really, I mean, you did touch on it really, in terms of the larger animals that most of us would probably think about in a wildlife category of being the penguins and the seals, and you know, they come seasonally and use the place, but it's not like you have caribou wandering around the continent.
No. In fact, on the terrestrial side, there's nothing big. So
Yeah. Okay, thank you. What are some of the big challenges that you have seen in Antarctica, both traveling there and working for the number of years that you've done that?
I'm sorry, what are the changes?
So what are the biggest, I'm sorry, I read it wrong, actually. Let me read it the way the person put it in. I misrepresented. What are some of the biggest changes, I said challenges, changes you have seen?
So as I said, environmentally, it's the change in like the size of glaciers is very apparent. On the McMurdo side, as I said, I work a lot on the sea ice, and we have never had an issue. Even going in the middle of summer, we've always had sea ice that we can work on. But my last trip there in 2018, I thought we were going to drown. The sea ice was very unstable. It was very thin. And in fact, halfway through the season, we weren't allowed to go out on it. So I guess that's one piece of evidence that the ice is melting.
Yeah.
So that's been a big change.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you. How are treaty decisions handled? Are they voted on like a one vote per one country, or how do the decisions get made?
Actually, that's a really good question. So yes, every country has one vote, but things are done by consensus. And so I'm very familiar with what happens in those CEP meetings, which run alongside the treaty meeting. And so what will happen is there'll be a discussion, and countries will be, going back and forth. And if there's any one country that decides they don't like something, it doesn't pass. And so the consensus is a very important part of the process. And
friendly neighborhood, Mr. Rogers. All right.
Right. And it's very interesting because a lot of the discussion and the decisions are actually made outside of the meeting. So it was very interesting for me, the first couple of meetings I went to realize that coffee breaks and lunch and dinner were like a really important part of the business.
Well, that kind of leads to another question, kind of politics. The politics of it is interesting. And that is, how much do changing US administrations influence what's going on down there? We've just changed, major change in sort of philosophy and whatnot. So from Obama to Trump to Biden, as a sort of coordinator, what impact does that have on what's going on down in Antarctica?
In terms of the science, I think that most of what would regulate that for NSF would be the budget. And so I don't know if there was that much change in the budgeting. In terms of the things like the Antarctic Treaty, that would all go through the State Department. And I don't know how to, I don't have any comment on that because I don't know what goes on at those higher levels.
Okay, all right, fair enough. I'm asking, well, I ask a couple of those questions, but your picture, your aerial picture of the stations, McMurdo and Palmer, et cetera, look way bigger than what I have somehow perceived in my mind. That aerial picture of McMurdo looked like a small village, you know, I mean, a relative, you know, modest, I mean, they looked like there were streets and whatever. And so as different countries come in there with their stations and handle ever increasing number of people, how do they actually handle the infrastructure? What do they do as far as generating power, and how do they provide fresh water for all those people? And most importantly, from my perspective, how are they dealing with the sewage in that pristine environment? What's happening with effluent?
Okay, so the stations, so McMurdo is pretty big. I think these days at peak population, McMurdo probably has about 1,000 people. And I can qualify that by saying only about 200 of them are scientists. The rest of them are all support. And McMurdo does have roads. It even has street signs. So McMurdo to me is it's almost like a mining town. And the US is right now going to completely revamp McMurdo Station. So in the future, it will be much sleeker, slimmer, not quite so mining townish. So there is that. At McMurdo, there's a water treatment plant. So the sewage is treated. Water is made by reverse osmosis. And all of those kinds of, that kind of infrastructure, the current stations, the new stations that are being built by countries are all as green as possible. So they're all taking advantage of any technology they can to reduce the carbon footprint. They put windmills in, wind generators. New Zealand has a station very close to McMurdo. So it was a cooperative effort between the two countries to put in wind generators. So those are the kinds of things that the Committee on Environmental Protection and the Antarctic Treaty kind of look over. And COMNAP, the Antarctic program managers, this is something that they're also very, very conscious of. And so there's a lot of effort made to try to make the stations as energy efficient as possible.
And Barbara just asked a question. This is a fun one. In the movie Where You Go, Bernadette, they are showing a moving science station. Was that total fiction?
Yes, it was. My friends made me read that because she went to Palmer Station in the book, but what they showed in the movie was not Palmer Station. And also the fact that she was able to just show up and be part of the station, that would never happen in the real world. They would never take you in like that.
Oh, very good. Thank you very much. Those are all really fascinating. And then just touch a little bit on, maybe as a final question, on obviously you got a weather impact on how much science you can get done and how the weather probably changes. Seasons, of course, you guys do prime time season, but there are people there all year long. So just a little bit about the impact. I mean, you talked about how really hard it is. I can imagine that you could show up and be delayed in all your science for 3 weeks while you all hunkered down in a storm or something. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, that's a very correct assessment. So the weather plays a really big role. And in fact, for a long time, every time we finished a season, we'd have to do this kind of outbrief. And one of the questions they would ask is, how many research days did you lose because of weather? So for example, if you're scheduled to go out and, in the field on a plane or a helicopter, you could, be delayed for a very long time if weather sets in and they can't get aircraft up in the air. Even traveling on the ice, there are certain conditions where you're not going to be going anywhere. So that always comes into play in terms of trying to get the work done. And for many of us, I mean, you can't go in the field, you end up working in the lab. So in some cases you can kind of, do something else with the time. In other cases, people that are working on the ice sheets or geologists, they have to get in the field. and not being able to fly out somewhere can put a really big dent in a research project.
So who makes the go, no-go decisions? Do each one of the stations like McMurdo or Palmer have the sheriff, the weather, the science sheriff that basically says small craft warnings, or we're not going out today? I mean, there's got to be one. There's probably one person that gets that decision, right?
Yes, so there are people who make those decisions, and the scientists do not make the decisions. So I can't go and say, well, I think it's safe, I want to go out. So there are various people who are in charge of things. So for example, the people in charge of helicopters would be deciding whether or not it's safe to put those up in the air. And then, at Palmer Station, we do a lot of boating, and they have very strict regulations as to when you can go out in a Zodiac. And so the station manager, in consultation with, the weather person, will tell us, no, you can't go out today.
How does one go about becoming the station manager? That sounds like a pretty high responsibility. Long time experience in Antarctic, or are they scientists? Or are they administrators?
They're usually not scientists. The National Science Foundation, well, the U.S. Antarctic Program through the National Science Foundation hires a contractor. So there's a civilian contractor that takes care of the logistics in the Antarctic. And the station managers are usually hired by the contractor. And oftentimes there are people that have been working with the contractor in another capacity at the station, and they just kind of work themselves up to being station manager.
Well, again, as one voice, and I'm going to throw it back to Leanne to unmute and close it up. But thank you very, very much. As I told you when we were chatting, I really look forward to it personally, and it was really fascinating. So thank you, Deneb. It was nice meeting you. And Leanne, there you go.
Yeah, it was an excellent.
You're kind of wobbly on your voice. Leanne, you're getting a lot of auditory feedback. There's something, your speakers are going back through.
We're all being underground helicopter.
All right, well, we kind of lost that. We had a little technical problem on our end, but again, on behalf of ACS San Diego.
With around.
Yeah, it's still not coming across, Leanne. So anyway, thank you very, very much. I will let you know when I process that and give you a link to it. So again, thank you very, very much. Wonderful presentation. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks for inviting me.